Chapter 2: Booze and Blackmail. The Whiskey Men. Per his own account, Samuel Bronfman had never planned to become one of North America's top liquor magnates, having previously aspired to a career in law. Nevertheless, true to his family's last name, which means whiskey man in Yiddish, he and his brothers went on to build a liquor empire that would rocket the Bronfmans into the upper echelons of the Western business elite, though the road they traveled to get there was hardly elegant. While the Bronfmans are now remembered as scions of Canada's upper class, this was certainly not the case when Samuel's parents, Mendel and Yikel Bronfman, brought the family to Canada from Bessarabia, now part of modern-day Moldova, and Ukraine in 1889. They had left as part of a wave of Jewish immigrants fleeing the anti-Semitic pogroms of Tsarist Russia, leaving behind a somewhat profitable tobacco farming business. In Bessarabia, they had been relatively well off and had immigrated to Canada, along with two of their servants and their personal rabbi. However, Canada, not particularly Manitoba, where the Bronfmans eventually settled, was poorly suited for tobacco farming, forcing Yechiel to labor on Canadian railroads and in sawmills before moving into the sale of firewood and the trading of livestock and fish. It would be their trading of horses that would eventually lead them to begin work in the hospitality sector and subsequently the liquor business. The Bronfmans' beginnings, particularly following their arrival in Canada, stand in such stark contrast to their current reputation that even Sam's sons, Edgar and Charles, were kept in the dark by their own father regarding the family business early days. He would never tell us any of the early history, Edgar Bronfman would later remember of his father. A Bronfman biographer, former senior editor at The Economist, Nicholas Faith, would also write that underlying the family's riches was a deep sense of shame as to their origins, and that Sam's generation had shared an absolute refusal to tell their offspring anything about their life before their arrival in the Promised Land, i.e., Canada. Part of the reason for this secrecy, even within the family and between father and son, was likely related to the personal struggle of many immigrants, some of whom choose to turn their back on their lives prior to immigrating and strive to establish and prove their connections to the new land in which they find themselves. Indeed, Sam Bronfman went to great lengths to do just that, publicly claiming for much of his late life that he had been born on March 4th, 1891, in Brandon, Manitoba, Canada, obfuscating both his real date and place of birth, February 27th, 1889, Bessarabia. Michael Morris, one of Bronfman's more sympathetic biographers, would write that Sam Bronfman never truly abandoned his enthusiastic identification with the country in which his career began, and his attempts to obfuscate his place of birth is perhaps the most significant indication of his obsession with the respectability he associated with Canadian citizenship. While Sam Bronfman was undoubtedly ill at ease with his status as an immigrant, there is another factor that may explain his unwillingness, and that of his 7 siblings, to discuss the family's early days, and, specifically, the chain of events and eventual alliances with unsavory characters that would lead them to the top of Canada's business elite. At some point in the early 1890s, as he sampled spirits in a dingy saloon after selling off some horses, Yikel Bronfman mulled the merits of leaving behind a life of hard labor in favor of the intertwined businesses of hospitality and liquor sales. Sam Bronfman would later claim that it was actually he who had convinced his father to move into hospitality and bartending, though most biographers doubt this, given Sam's age at the time. Regardless, it would be over a decade before the Bronfman family patriarch and his eldest sons managed to scrape together the funds necessary to realize Yikel's dreams. The Bronfmans had saved enough money to lease their first Canadian hotel, the Anglo-American Hotel in Emerson, Manitoba, by 1903. Soon, they acquired several more hotels in Yorkton, Saskatchewan, and later in Winnipeg and beyond, building a small yet profitable network of hotels prior to the onset of World War I. The dramatic shift in the family's fortune was largely thanks to the business acumen of Sam's brother Harry, who managed to stave off the financial damage and legal trouble caused by the gambling and other unseemly habits of their older brother Abe. Sam Bronfman formally joined the new family business in 1907, though he would later regale some of his biographers with tales of how he had been the original dynamo behind the family's success in hospitality, despite considerable evidence to the contrary. What is notable, however, is the fact that, not long after Sam formally became involved in hotel management, the family's hotels were targeted by a series of unfortunate accusations, including when they went to renew their liquor license in Yorktown in 1908. Locals had alleged that the Bronfmans were guilty of violating local liquor laws and condoning illegal gambling in their inns. The latter is particularly likely given the well-known gambling habits of Abe Bronfman, which were known to have threatened the family business on more than one occasion. The same year that Sam joined the family's hotel business, the organization that would eventually bring Prohibition to Canada also emerged, the Social and Moral Reform Council. A joining of the leadership of various Protestant churches, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Royal Templars of Temperance, and other like-minded groups, the Social and Moral Reform Council was born out of a far-reaching Protestant religious movement of the period, known as the Social Gospel movement, that sought to fight social evils, particularly those caused or exacerbated by rapid urbanization and industrialization. For groups like the Social and Moral Reform Council, liquor quickly became a main target. The council and its allies managed to successfully appeal to many Canadians, both those who shared and lacked their religious zeal, as bars and saloons were often disliked for other reasons aside from their moral depravity, such as their often far-reaching stenches and the fact that around a third of criminal prosecutions at the time were related to drunkenness. Though the temperance movement in Canada deeply divided its population, it got the boost it needed to become common policy with the onset of the First World War. In Canada, Prohibition was initially a provincial matter, with a handful of provinces having enacted prohibition laws prior to the war. Yet, once the curtain of war had fallen, many Canadians came to believe that banning the sale, trade, and manufacture of alcohol would aid the war effort. As a result, most Canadian provinces enacted some sort of alcohol ban prior to Canada's short-lived federal ban, enacted near the end of the war in 1918, and expiring a year after hostilities ended. The impact of Prohibition on Canada's liquor industry was substantial and felt long after it was repealed, with 75% of its breweries having closed by 1928. However, Prohibition was conveniently fortuitous for some, the Bronfmans chief among them. Given the provincial nature of Prohibition in Canada prior to its brief stint as a federal policy, the differences between the temperance laws of various provinces provided numerous loopholes that the Bronfmans were able to exploit to great effect. So successful were the Bronfmans at aptly working in the gray area of the varied and often temporary gaps between provincial laws that author Peter Newman remarked in his biography of the Bronfmans, Bronfman Dynasty, the Rothschilds of the New World. Sometimes it almost seemed that the American Congress and the Canadian federal and provincial legislatures must have secretly held a grand conclave to decide one issue: how they could draft anti-liquor laws and regulations that would help maximize the Bronfman brothers' bootlegging profits. In one example, during World War I, the three eldest Bronfman brothers, Abe, Harry, and Sam, exploited the fact that Manitoba and Ontario, while prohibiting the sale of liquor within the province, allowed alcohol to be imported. The brothers set up several mail-order liquor businesses throughout these two provinces and profited handsomely. That is, until the ban on interprovincial trading would go into effect in 1918 with federal prohibition. However, federal prohibition also came with a loophole, which allowed alcohol to be sold for medicinal purposes. This prompted Harry Bronfman to create a wholesale drug company that permitted him to import alcohol in bulk and provide it to area pharmacies. He placed its offices next door to one of the family's ritzier hotels, the Balmoral, and its business model involved offering doctors a bonus for each liquor prescription they wrote if that prescription was fulfilled by a pharmacy whose liquor was furnished by the Bronfmans. Canadian writer Mordecai Rickler would later allege that the initial license for Harry's new enterprise, named the Canada Pure Drug Company, was acquired by a well-placed bribe to a prominent politician. Other family biographers, like Michael Morris, called the firm a thinly disguised liquor outlet that soon pumped more whiskey into retail drugstores than any other wholesaler in Saskatchewan. The company also benefited from the corruption of the province's liquor commission, which allowed a percentage of the liquor it seized to be sold back to Harry Bronfman, who then resold it at an exorbitantly marked up price. Subsequent government investigations that were part of a royal commission would further allege that the Bronfman family drug company was never engaged in the drug business, but confined its activities to the sale of alcohol in the western provinces, adding that the company imported hundreds of thousands of gallons of alcohol from the United States. Out of the Bronfman brothers, it had been Sam who was sent to travel across Canada and the United States, which allowed him to build a vast network that included numerous American and Canadian distilleries and bootleggers. This network would, in a few years, prove essential to the Bronfmans, especially Sam, once Prohibition arrived in Canada's southern neighbor, the United States. The many friends of Mr. Sam. Beyond the complicity of corrupt officials and doctors, a driving force behind the Bronfman family's Prohibition-era success was their ties, forged by Sam, to the Hudson's Bay Company, long a dominant force in Canada's economy, backed by the political and economic elite of England since its founding in the 1600s. According to Nicholas Faith, Hudson's Bay Company trusted him, Sam, implicitly after he had refused to make any profit on a couple of thousand cases of Dewar's whiskey that Hudson's Bay wanted to buy back from him. However, in the cutthroat and often extremely violent world of bootlegging in Canada, implicit trust was unlikely to have been granted from just a single act. More likely was the fact that Hudson's Bay Company had long been the dominant force in Canada's liquor industry and had every intention of continuing to operate its liquors business during Prohibition. The Bronfmans were sure to have caught their attention early on, not just through their mail order business, but because Harry Bronfman had quickly gained a reputation as the king of bootleggers, who was able to easily skirt the law due to his contacts with corrupt local and provincial officials. His brother Sam sought to focus the entire family business on liquor early on in Prohibition, which would have made him a critical contact for any business seeking to clandestinely deal with the Bronfman's sale of spirits during this period. The Hudson's Bay Company's import of liquor into Canada by various means during Prohibition greatly aided the business of several distillers in England and Scotland. Many of those British distillers boasted close ties to the royal family and England's political elite, like Dewar's. These companies risked losing a considerable amount of income if their ability to export spirits to Canada had been entirely cut off, especially at a time when drinking in England was on the wane. The British government itself was clearly aware of these concerns and made the promotion of exports, liquor in particular, a key policy aimed at offsetting the country's considerable war debts. Direct ties of the company to bootlegging in Canada emerged when British Columbia's Prohibition Commissioner, Walter Findlay, was caught engaging in and profiting from the illegal liquor trade. At his trial, the existence of a liquor delivery service run by the Hudson's Bay Company that sent alcohol to private addresses and spanned the nation was revealed, despite Findlay's refusal to testify. Whatever the real story was behind the ties that were forged between Sam Bronfman and the Hudson's Bay Company, the dominant distillers of England and Scotland that held great sway over the company's liquor subsidiary would be critical to Bronfman's success during and after Prohibition, and he to theirs. Soon after the conclusion of Canadian Prohibition, Prohibition went into effect in the United States in January 1920. The Bronfmans, now largely under Sam's leadership, continued to import American liquor at incredible quantities, but at a much cheaper rate, given that the new law had made it essentially worthless in its country of origin. That imported liquor was then mixed with raw alcohol and water. This degradation allowed the Bronfmans to ship a much larger quantity of the liquor than they had purchased back into the United States. Such was the story of the Bronfman family's initial entry into the distilling business. As stock from American distilleries began to run out in 1923, the Bronfmans built a distillery near Montreal. They named their newest venture Distillers Corporation Limited, the same name as the then unrelated and significantly more prestigious Scottish company that included the top 5 whiskey and gin producers in the British Isles. The name the Bronfmans had chosen was no coincidence, as the audacious name Sam had chosen for the family's first distillery succeeded in attracting the near immediate attention of the Scottish firm. The Bronfman family subsequently formed a joint venture with the elite of Scotland's and England's liquor industry, thereby uniting the two companies that shared the name Distillers Corporation Limited. Their union also allowed the Bronfmans to secure the exclusive rights to import many of the top brands from across the pond. Roughly a decade later, in the 1930s, Samuel Bronfman purchased and built a number of distilleries in Scotland, further deepening his ties to the liquor barons of the Old World. The ability of the Bronfmans to secure this deal at the time likely owed to Sam's pre-existing ties to the Hudson's Bay Company, which had previously imported many of the brands united under the British Distillers Company Limited. Another potential factor was the chance meeting between one of the Bronfman's middlemen, Louis Rosenstiel, and Winston Churchill in 1922. A year later, Bronfman traveled to Kentucky, where Rosenstiel was based at the time, and purchased an ailing distillery, the components of which were then shipped north and used to create the Bronfman's first distillery. Churchill had deep family and personal ties to the Hudson's Bay Company, and from 1919 to 1922, he was in charge of Britain's colonial office. In this capacity, Churchill refused to use British authority or influence to interfere with the liquor trade in any British colony, including in British-dominated Rum Row, where the Bronfmans were also active. Churchill argued that England was not obligated to enforce the laws of another nation and would later call Prohibition as a policy an affront to the whole history of mankind. Churchill would later emerge as a key investor in America's post-Prohibition liquor industry, which Bronfman and Rosenstiel would quickly come to dominate. As the Bronfman family's clout in the liquor industry grew after Prohibition, Sam Bronfman would later manage to personally meet Queen Elizabeth II of England, and he would even create a Canadian whiskey, Crown Royal, to specifically commemorate her visit to Canada in 1939. 5 years after creating the successful joint venture with Distillers Company Limited, the Bronfman's Distillers Corporation Limited purchased Joseph E. Seagram's and Sons Limited and their distillery in Waterloo, Ontario. The merged company became Seagram Company Limited, or Seagrams, and would serve as the Bronfman family's financial vehicle, not just for their ever-expanding liquor empire, but their subsequent interests in chemicals, oil, and entertainment. Though his British and Scottish connections were important to his and Seagram's success, Sam Bronfman's rise as a global liquor baron also depended significantly on the ties he had forged, often through his middlemen, with more unsavory actors, namely key figures in North American organized crime. Many of them still live on in American urban legend and were discussed at length in the previous chapter, including Charles Lucky Luciania, Mo Dalitz, Abner Longy Zwillman, Meyer Lansky, and members of Detroit's Purple Gang, among others. Much of the Bronfman's early involvement in bootlegging took place across the Saskatchewan-North Dakota border in boozoriums, where their liquor could be purchased in Canada and then moved to their final destination in the United States. Yet, the murder of a Bronfman brother-in-law turned associate and the promise of more lucrative markets for Bronfman booze soon drew their attention elsewhere. We were late starters in the two most lucrative markets, on the high seas and across the Detroit River. What came out of the border trade in Saskatchewan was insignificant by comparison, Bronfman once told Canadian journalist Terence Robertson. Despite being late to the game, this was when we started to make our real money, Bronfman recounted. The bootlegging operation of the Bronfmans would later extend far beyond the Canadian-US border, with the family establishing warehouses and fronts throughout the Caribbean and Mexico. They were encircling their main market, the United States, like prey. Of course, with great profit came great risk, and though they avoided major legal trouble for their ties to bootlegging operations during American Prohibition, it caught up with them soon after. In 1934, the Bronfman brothers were charged with conspiracy to violate the statutes of a friendly country and for evading taxes on liquor that they had exported out of Canada. Soon after the charges were announced, Sam Bronfman allegedly ordered the destruction of thousands of documents aimed at shielding their early operations from inquisitorial eyes. And Bronfman-owned companies tied to smuggling and their assets would mysteriously vanish. As a result, the case against the Bronfmans ran into an insurmountable roadblock, and the four Bronfman brothers were acquitted on all charges by the summer of 1935. They even managed to settle with U.S. authorities, negotiating a $3 million settlement with the Treasury Department, a mere fraction of what they had gained during American Prohibition. Most of Bronfman's mob associates during American Prohibition were members of, or somehow tied to, the National Crime Syndicate. This syndicate, described in detail in the previous chapter, was subsequently defined by the 1950s Senate investigative body, the Kefauver Committee, as a confederation of organized crime interests then dominated by the Italian-American Mafia and the Jewish-American mob. During the Kefauver Committee's investigation, some of the biggest players in the American Mafia named Bronfman as a central figure in their bootlegging operations. Though Sam was careful to distance himself as much as possible from prominent criminals, he did have a somewhat cozy relationship with Meyer Lansky, with Lansky's wife later recounting how Bronfman had thrown lavish dinner parties for her husband. The relationship appears to have begun in 1923, when Lansky bought Sam prized tickets to the boxing championship between Jack Dempsey and Louis Firpo in New York, likely a gesture aimed at gaining Sam's favor, or perhaps returning one. Subsequently, Lansky would, among other things, offer exclusive protection of Bronfman's booze shipments. In his old age, Lansky, apparently bitter that Bronfman had managed to launder his post-Prohibition reputation into that of an upstanding member of North American aristocracy, would remark, "Why is Lansky a gangster and not the Bronfman and Rosenstiel families? I was involved with all of them in the 1920s, although they do not like to talk about it, and change the subject when my name is mentioned." The ties between the Bronfman family business and organized crime may explain why some past efforts to chronicle the rise of the Bronfmans were ill-fated, particularly during Sam Bronfman's lifetime. The first person who attempted to write a biography of Samuel Bronfman, Terence Robertson, had traveled to New York to investigate Bronfman and the then sprawling corporate empire of Seagrams. While in New York, he had allegedly concluded the book, but had telephoned a journalist colleague back in Canada, distraught. In that phone call, Robertson claimed to have found out things about Sam they didn't want me to write about. Robertson would call a second colleague, stressing that his life had been threatened, and we would know who was doing the threatening, but that he would do the job himself. After receiving the frantic call and fearing that Robertson's life was in danger, the second journalist called the New York police, who quickly responded, only to find Robertson dying of barbiturate poisoning, to which he succumbed. Robertson's lengthy interviews with Bronfman were never published, but still exist in manuscript form. Subsequent attempts to author a biography of Sam Bronfman and his family's rise to prominence also failed to make it to publication, such as the effort made by former editor of the Canadian edition of Time magazine, John Scott, and another made by Canadian journalist Erna Paris. However, some books on the Bronfman family did emerge once Sam had reached old age, such as an account of the family by Peter Newman and a novel by Mordecai Rickler, believed to have been inspired by the Bronfmans. The Bronfmans apparently did not take kindly to their portrayal by either Newman or Rickler, both of whom were Jewish, prompting the family behind Seagram's to allege that both authors were anti-Semitic Jews. The Bronfman clan has always been sensitive to critical reports, given that their long-standing efforts to develop their reputation as elite philanthropists are marred by the evidence of the symbiotic relationship between their family business and organized crime. The Middlemen. Aside from these more personal ties, also crucial to the success of Seagram's and the Bronfman family enterprise during this period were an assortment of middlemen. Two of these men were particularly essential to the Bronfman business, Joseph Reinfeld and the aforementioned Louis Lou Rosenstiel. The two men were of extremely different temperaments, with Reinfeld being described as a jovial, avuncular Jewish immigrant from Poland, whereas Rosenstiel was described as loud, opinionated, and domineering. Reinfeld served as a close advisor to Sam Bronfman, as well as an important business associate, as he was the principal purchaser of Seagram's whiskey. It was also Reinfeld who convinced Sam to build up inventory prior to and during Prohibition, which would help Bronfman secure a significant portion of the post-Prohibition liquor market. He also managed much of the in-person dealings with crime-linked individuals on Bronfman's behalf, which was key to Bronfman's winning strategy to mitigate legal risks and prevent further damage to his social reputation. The end result saw Reinfeld buy large amounts of Seagram's liquor, mainly at Rum Row, while ensuring that the Bronfmans did not have to directly deal with their final crime-linked customers. However, in at least one instance, Reinfeld actually brought Sam Bronfman. Let's fix that. We made it pretty far without having to do a fix. I'm going to fix that one. That was a big enough mess up to see where we're at. Okay, let's start right there. However, okay. However, in at least one instance, Reinfeld actually brought Sam Bronfman and his family business into close contact with a notorious mobster. By 1923, the Reinfeld syndicate was half owned by Longy Zwillman, who Reinfeld sent to negotiate directly with Sam Bronfman. Bronfman was reportedly very impressed with Zwillman, then in his early 20s, calling him well-behaved and studious-looking, adding that you'd never guess he was a Starker. Reinfeld's operation during Prohibition was massive and massively profitable for Bronfman. Government investigators later revealed that Reinfeld had imported nearly 40% of all the illicit alcohol consumed in the United States during Prohibition. Retired U.S. Treasury agents later testified the Bronfman family were Reinfeld's main supplier, while also alleging that much of Reinfeld's ill-gotten profits had been laundered in Canada, some of it allegedly laundered with the help of Seagram's employees. The use of Canadian institutions as laundries for Reinfeld is not only plausible, but likely, given the intimate involvement of the Royal Bank of Canada in Rum Row, the same place where Reinfeld had received his shipments of Bronfman liquor. The Bronfmans themselves were known to operate a network of shell companies, some registered to fictitious individuals, and linked to a series of both domestic and foreign bank accounts. This network facilitated the family's own elaborate money laundering operations, according to Canadian historian Stephen Schneider. The close association between Bronfman and Reinfeld would later come back to haunt them both, particularly when Reinfeld's longtime bodyguard, James Rutkin, testified in front of the Kefauver Committee in the early 1950s. Rutkin would tell all regarding the early days of the Bronfman family business, including the relationships of both Bronfman and Reinfeld with mobsters like Zwilman and Lansky. Some Bronfman family biographers, like Nicholas Faith, have alleged that Rutkin sought to use his testimony in a failed attempt to blackmail the Bronfmans, threatening to reveal more if he was left uncompensated. Among Rutkin's claims regarding the Bronfmans, several pertained to the family's hotel business in Canada that had preceded their liquor empire. Rutkin, describing the Bronfmans as four brothers from Montreal, teased the Kefauver Committee, stating first that if you want to find out more about the Bronfman-owned hotels, you can ask the Canadian Mounted Police, and they will tell you about the little hotels, and you can use your imagination. He later added that these hotels serviced people who slept very fast, and that the same room would be rented quite a few times during the night, implying that the hotels were in fact brothels. Several Bronfman family biographers also mention these accusations, which had dogged the family since their earliest days in the hotel business. Some believe that Sam Bronfman tacitly confirmed that this was the case many years after Rutkin first made these claims, when he remarked, "If they were brothels, they were the best in the West." Nevertheless, in the early 1950s, at the time of the Kefauver hearings, the Bronfmans alleged that Rutkin's claims were absurd, and they declined to pony up any of the hush money that Rutkin was rumored to have been seeking. Yet, despite their best efforts, Rutkin's testimony, which received considerable publicity due to the televised broadcast of the hearings, created a whirlwind of rumors that refused to be snuffed out for some time, at least until Rutkin turned up dead, having allegedly slit his own throat with a borrowed razor in 1956. Louis Rosenstiel, the other most prominent of Sam Bronfman's Prohibition-era middlemen, saw his relationship with the Seagram's chairman take a completely different trajectory than that of Bronfman and Reinfeld. As Prohibition neared its end, Rosenstiel and Bronfman would grow into bitter rivals, despite continuing to share many of the same contacts in the North America criminal underworld. The chairman. While Sam Bronfman struggled with his would-be biographers, no biography was ever written of his one-time middleman and later chief rival, Louis Rosenstiel. Of those books and other writings that do touch on Rosenstiel's history and demeanor, few are favorable. For instance, a 1959 piece in Esquire offers one of the more favorable accounts, calling Rosenstiel intelligent, articulate, and extraordinarily aggressive, adding that he often slopes his chair, plays with his tongue as he speaks, and utters his strong opinions with a growl, expressing dislike and contempt for anyone who might disagree. Others, like Bronfman biographer Nicholas Faith, describe Rosenstiel as loud, opinionated, and domineering, a hulking figure who favored amber-tinted glasses, which he rarely removed, and large cigars to go with his status as one of the wealthiest men alive. The New York Times obituary for Rosenstiel uses similar terms, referring to the liquor baron known to many simply as the chairman, as having been a domineering man with a quick temper. Official accounts of Rosenstiel's past and how he built his company, Schnelly, into a corporate behemoth seem oddly sanitized, not unlike the official accounts of the Bronfman family's early days that declined to mention the darker side of their business model that was particularly important to their activities prior to the repeal of American Prohibition. Born in 1891 in Cincinnati, Ohio, Rosenstiel, thanks to an unfortunate injury during a football match in his teenage years, dropped out of high school and went to work for his uncle at the Seagram Distilling Company in Milton, Kentucky in 1907. Rosenstiel worked on largely menial tasks at the facility, including as a pin hooker, rolling barrels in warehouses, and as a belt splicer. His fortunes shifted dramatically from those humble beginnings during the era of American Prohibition, with little being known of his life during the period, aside from him allegedly leaving the tedious tasks of his uncle's distillery behind to become a whiskey broker. According to official accounts, Rosenstiel turned to selling shoes and bonds once Prohibition set in, with his prior line of work in the distilling and sale of spirits drying up. Yet, somehow, the young Rosenstiel accumulated enough money to afford a vacation to the French Riviera in 1922. It was during that vacation that he would be lucky enough to score a chance meeting with Winston Churchill, who advised him to prepare for the return of liquor sales in the United States, per the New York Times. There is little, if any, context given in official accounts as to how or why a high school dropout turned distillery worker and shoe salesman would have attracted the attention of a notorious elitist and member of the British aristocracy like Churchill. As the story goes, Rosenstiel spent the next 10 years of his life dutifully following Churchill's advice. He somehow convinced one of the most powerful banks on Wall Street, Lehman Brothers, to offer him a massive loan to finance his acquisition of closed distilleries and to accumulate aged whiskey inventories for the yet-to-materialize date of repeal. Again, no official explanation is offered as to how an elite banking institution like Lehman Brothers would grant someone with Rosenstiel's background such a large amount of capital based merely on advice he had received from a British politician, suggesting there is more to the story. Returning to the official narrative of Rosenstiel's rise, we are told that Rosenstiel then incorporated Schnelly Distillers Company in the wake of repeal in 1933. He was conveniently well placed to become the most powerful figure in the distilled spirits business, all thanks to him having heeded Churchill's advice and thanks to a remarkable patience that he was never known to have possessed during any other point in his life. Indeed, per these same official sources, impatience rather than patience was one of Rosenstiel's most well-known traits, with his characterization by media as a domineering man with a quick temper being one of many examples. Of course, as should be clear to the reader, this narrative conveniently obfuscates any hint of illegality in Rosenstiel's Prohibition-era dealings, and fails to mention Rosenstiel's documented ties to organized crime figures or his role as a prominent purchaser of Bronfman liquor, alongside Joseph Reinfeldt and other Seagram's middlemen. Years later, James P. Kelly, chief investigator for the Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee of the New York House of Representatives, testified under oath that Rosenstiel had been part of an underworld consortium that bought Bronfman liquor and sold it throughout the United States during Prohibition. Key figures in this consortium, aside from Rosenstiel, included Meyer Lansky, as well as Joe Fusco, an associate of Al Capone, and Joe Lindsay, a Boston-based criminal associated with Joe Kennedy's bootlegging operations. Kelly added that the Rosenstiel was particularly close to Lansky, and it later emerged that they had owned points together in mob-operated businesses. He was also reportedly close to Frank Costello, who was said to have attended a business meeting alongside Rosenstiel, to give the meeting's attendees a message that Rosenstiel was one of their people. One of Rosenstiel's ex-wives, Susan Kaufman, later told journalist Anthony Summers that, in Summers' words, living with Rosenstiel was to live with the command structure of organized crime. Kaufman's testimony to Summers includes numerous specific and very detailed allegations of the various meetings between her ex-husband and organized crime figures she witnessed during their marriage, including business meetings where Rosenstiel was given thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars in bundles of cash from Lansky. After Prohibition, Fusco and Lindsay took their operations into the legal and legitimate business world, just as Rosenstiel had done. They set up legitimate companies in Chicago and Boston, respectively, to market Chanel products. As a result, Rosenstiel maintained his links to the criminal underworld long after publicly transitioning from bootlegger to businessman. Frequent dinner guests at Rosenstiel's home in the years and decades after Prohibition included legendary figures of American organized crime, including Frank Costello, Sam Giancana, Santo Trafficante, and Meyer Lansky. Lansky was known to address Rosenstiel as Supreme Commander, a name that Roy Cohn, Rosenstiel's attorney and close friend, also used for the liquor baron. Rosenstiel's transition from bootlegger to businessman very nearly included a direct partnership with Sam Bronfman. In 1929, as the end of Prohibition neared, Bronfman invested $585,000 in a Rosenstiel-owned distillery producing medicinal spirits, and had acquired a 20% stake in Rosenstiel's company. Per Sam, however, he concluded after visiting Rosenstiel's distillery that it was a piece of junk, and on the inside it was even worse. And he was allegedly offended at the inferiority of his whiskey production method. It's unclear if this was the actual motive for their falling out, but regardless, their subsequent business and personal rivalries became legendary. According to Nicholas Faith's account of Bronfman's life, the falling out with Rosenstiel, whatever the cause, took a tremendous emotional toll on the two men before it descended into a decades-long, acrimonious spat. Faith asserts that Bronfman's failure to reach an agreement with Rosenstiel really hit him, for he came down with severe flu. Soon after calling off any possibility of a partnership. Despite being gravely ill, Bronfman told Rosenstiel that we have nothing to discuss when the latter had arrived to attempt to salvage a deal. Terence Robertson's manuscript, as cited by Faith, states that Rosenstiel all but wept as he begged for just a minute with my friend. Their feud would subsequently escalate to such an extent that it would transcend business competition, with a 1959 article in Esquire noting that either man appears willing to sacrifice profit to do the other in the eye. Rosenstiel was known to refer to Bronfman and his business as unscrupulous alien competition, with alien in this instance meaning foreign, i.e., Canadian. Bronfman, for his part, was known to become angry rather quickly when Rosenstiel's name or business came up, saying he had no admiration for the man and would frequently refer to him as Rosenstiel, with Schlemiel meaning something along the lines of simpleton or a born loser in Yiddish. It was also alleged that Bronfman's lavish Seagram building in New York City had been planned to make Rosenstiel's 1930s-style offices in the Empire State Building look just a little shabby in their luxury. The king of bourbon and blackmail. Though both men had legendary tempers and a legendary feud to match, Bronfman and Rosenstiel had major differences in character, particularly in how they managed their respective businesses and in their personal lives. One of these differences was the fact that Sam Bronfman did not share Rosenstiel's obsession with blackmail. Indeed, reports of Rosenstiel's behavior at his company's offices, as cited by Nicholas Faith, included Rosenstiel having placed bugging devices throughout his offices. Per Faith, he would treat his employees like dirt, sacking them at a moment's notice, and then go to the toilet to leave them time to compromise themselves by talking in his absence. Those employees were compromised as their conversations were recorded by the devices that Rosenstiel had strewn about the premises. Additional assertions made in court and under oath by one of Rosenstiel's ex-wives held that Rosenstiel had also placed microphones throughout his home in order to record conversations that took place at social events he hosted for the alleged purpose of obtaining potential blackmail against his guests. In addition, several sources reported to the 1971 New York State Legislative Committee on Crime that Rosenstiel's Manhattan home had been wired from roof to basement with hidden microphones so that he could spy on visitors and staff. The system in Rosenstiel's home had been installed by Fred Otash, an infamous private detective who had used electronic means to spy on the Kennedy family, Marilyn Monroe, and others. Otash later said that Rosenstiel's home was rigged to tape conversations for hours on end. Otash had a penchant for blackmail himself, particularly sexual blackmail. He had once attempted to entrap John F. Kennedy using a call girl named Sue Young in the lead-up to the 1960 presidential election. As we'll see shortly, Rosenstiel was also involved in a broader effort to obtain this variety of blackmail, which may explain why he had sought out the California-based Otash to bug his New York home. Some of the sources that discuss Rosenstiel's interest in blackmail also claim that Rosenstiel was bisexual. According to Nicholas Faith, discussions about Rosenstiel's bisexuality among Schnelly office employees were frequent enough for Rosenstiel to be referred to as Rosie around the office. Additional evidence for these claims later came from Rosenstiel's fourth wife, Susan Kaufman. Per Kaufman, whose previous marriage had collapsed because her first husband had been homosexual, she soon discovered that she had made a similar mistake in marrying Rosenstiel. Rosenstiel was reportedly uninterested in having sex with his new wife, but went to great expense to have her dress up in clothes that made her look like a little girl. He would later be discovered in bed with one of his lawyers, Roy Cohn, and shrugged it off to his wife by asking for some more alone time with his attorney. Kaufman remembered responding, "I've never seen Governor Thomas Dewey in bed with you," as Dewey was also one of his attorneys at the time, and she walked out. Kaufman remembered the young Cohn, who was best known for his infamous stint as Joe McCarthy's chief counsel during the height of the Red Scare, as flaunting his homosexuality whenever he was around Kaufman, openly caressing a former congressional associate in front of her, and describing the homosexual antics of a close friend of his and Rosenstiel's, Cardinal Spellman, one of the most powerful figures in the Catholic Church in North America. Cohn reportedly was so open with her because her first husband had been gay, and I must have understood because I'd stayed with him for 9 years, Kaufman later stated. In 1958, Kaufman accompanied her husband, Louis Rosenstiel, to a party hosted by Cohn at the Plaza Hotel in New York. Kaufman recalled entering through a side entrance and taking an elevator to the second or third floor. Her husband knew the way well enough that she had the impression he had been there before. The suite was one of the largest available at the hotel, and it was all done in light blue. Inside the suite were Cohn and another figure closely associated with both Cohn and Rosenstiel, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. To Kaufman's surprise, Hoover was wearing women's clothes and wig, with Cohn introducing him as Mary in a bout of barely concealed laughter. Mary was also incidentally the nickname widely used among New York Catholic clergy for Cardinal Spellman, who was also alleged to attend other parties hosted by Cohn in the Plaza's Blue Suite. After having served a few drinks, Kaufman recalled seeing a couple of boys come in, young blonde boys, I'd say about 18 or 19. And then Roy Cohn makes the signal we should go into the bedroom. Sexual activities between the young blonde boys, Cohn and Hoover, ensued, with Kaufman declining to participate after being urged to do so by her then husband. The Rosenstiels then left, leaving the boys alone with Cohn and Hoover. Cohn later laughed about the incident to Kaufman, saying that Mary Hoover attends his parties regularly, and that he would make sure to arrive at the plaza first with his clothes, the female clothes allegedly used by Hoover at the parties, in a suitcase. Per her testimony, Kaufman was repulsed by the whole affair, but ended up attending another of these parties at the plaza after Rosenstiel bribed her with an expensive pair of earrings from Harry Winston's. The events of that evening played out as they had the time before, but the Rosenstiels later quarreled, and she never attended any more Cohn-hosted parties at the Plaza Hotel. These allegations made by Kaufman resulted in considerable efforts to discredit her testimony, especially during the 1971 New York State Legislative Committee on Crime. Kaufman had agreed to serve as a witness for the state regarding her ex-husband's ties to organized crime figures. The very week that she was due to testify, Kaufman was hit with an attempted perjury charge that was regarded as unprecedented and bizarre by lawyers and outraged the committee's chairman and chief counsel. Kaufman still testified, but mostly behind closed doors in executive session. Her testimony, several decades later, still remains sealed. Members of the committee believed at the time that the attempted perjury charges had been instigated by Louis Rosenstiel himself in order to prevent his wife from testifying, as he had previously used similar tactics to protect his corrupt dealings. This attempted perjury charge has since been used by some authors to discredit Kaufman's later testimony regarding her ex-husband and his associates. However, the former chief counsel of the crime committee, New York Judge Edward McLaughlin, and committee investigator William Glenarrow found Kaufman to be an exceptionally good witness. McLaughlin later told journalist and Hoover biographer Anthony Summers, "I thought her absolutely truthful. The woman's power of recall was phenomenal. Everything she said was checked and double-checked, and everything that was checkable turned out to be true." Additional evidence corroborating Kaufman as a witness came from two male witnesses who supported the astonishing allegations of Hoover's habit of cross-dressing, with those witnesses having learned of the former FBI director's habit at a different time and place than the events described by Kaufman. They also had no knowledge of Hoover and the Blue Suite parties in New York. In addition, Kaufman told Anthony Summers that she possessed photographs showing Hoover in the company of Louis Rosenstiel's organized crime associates. Though Summers did not see these pictures personally, they were confirmed as authentic and had been seen by journalist Mary Nichols of the Philadelphia Inquirer. Nichols told Summers, "She did have suitcases of photographs that she had hauled away from her marriage to Louis Rosenstiel. The ones I saw showed Hoover, lawyer Roy Cohn, and Rosenstiel at all sorts of social events with mobsters." There is also evidence that not only did these parties at the Plaza Hotel take place, but that they were used to obtain sexual blackmail, with Kaufman asserting that her husband possessed pictures of Hoover wearing women's clothes, and that those images had been passed to Rosenstiel's associate, mobster Meyer Lansky. Journalist and author Anthony Summers had noted that, given Rosenstiel's interest and ability to have his residences and businesses bugged, Rosenstiel was quite capable of having the sex sessions at the plaza bugged or arranging for Edgar to be photographed in his female costumes. In addition, New York attorney John Klotz, tasked with investigating Roy Cohn for a case well after Kaufman's testimony, independently found evidence of the Blue Suite at the Plaza Hotel and its role in a sex extortion ring after combing through local government documents and information gathered by private detectives. It allegedly involved minors, as well as young men aged 18 and older. Klotz later summarized his findings, telling journalist and author Burton Hirsch, "Roy Cohn was providing protection. There were a bunch of pedophiles involved. That's where Cohn got his power from. Blackmail." Further confirmation of Rosenstiel's and Cohn's activities in the Blue Suite, later determined to be Suite 233, came from statements made by Cohn himself, the former NYPD detective and ex-head of the department's Human Trafficking and Vice-Related Crimes Division, James Rothstein. Rothstein later told John DeCamp, a former Nebraska state senator who investigated the Franklin scandal of the 1980s, that Cohn had admitted to being part of a sexual blackmail operation targeting politicians with minors during a sit-down interview with the former detective. Rothstein told DeCamp the following about Cohn. "Cohn's job was to run the little boys. Say you had an admiral, a general, a congressman, who did not want to go along with the program. Cohn's job was to set them up, then they would go along. Cohn told me that himself." Rothstein later told Paul David Collins, a former journalist turned researcher, that Cohn had also identified this sexual blackmail operation as being part of the anti-communist crusade of the time. The fact that Cohn, per Rothstein's recollection, stated that this sex blackmail ring was part of the anti-communist crusade coupled with Hoover's involvement in these blue suite events, suggested that elements of the government, including Hoover's FBI, may have been connected at a much broader level to the operation in a way that transcended Hoover's own personal involvement. Rothstein confirmed his statements to both DeCamp and Collins in an interview with me that was conducted in early 2020. He additionally told me that Cohn had told him that his role in this ring had originally come about because he himself had been entrapped and blackmailed, leading Rothstein to feel some sort of sympathy for Cohn. For those that may find it hard to believe that such an operation would take place with the involvement of the FBI director, there are also other related allegations to consider. That American intelligence operatives and organized crime had competed and then collaborated to blackmail Hoover years before Kaufman witnessed these events at the Plaza Hotel beginning in 1958. Lansky was credited with obtaining compromising photos of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover sometime in the 1940s, which showed Hoover in some kind of gay situation, according to a former Lansky associate, who also said that Lansky had often said of Hoover, "I fixed that son of a bitch." Meyer Lansky's widow also later claimed that her husband had acquired hard proof of Hoover's homosexuality and used it to neutralize the FBI as a threat to his own operations. The photos showed Hoover engaged in sexual activity, specifically oral sex, with his longtime friend, FBI Deputy Director Clyde Tolson. There is considerable separate evidence from the period that the close professional relationship between Hoover and Tolson was also intimate, and that this was an open secret in Washington. At some point, these photos fell into the hands of CIA counterintelligence chief James J. Angleton, who later showed the photos to several other CIA officials, including John Weitz and Gordon Novel. Both Weitz and Novel later stated that the pictures they had seen showed Hoover engaged in oral sex on a man who Angleton identified as Tolson. However, only Hoover's face was recognizable in the photographs. Angleton also claimed that the photos had been taken in 1946. Angleton was in charge of the CIA's relationship with the FBI as well as Israeli intelligence until he left the agency in 1972. Angleton was also a CIA figure who had pushed for the agency to forge ties with Meyer Lansky, raising the possibility that Angleton could have received the photo from Lansky. However, Anthony Summers, in Official and Confidential, The Secret Life of J. Edgar Hoover, has argued that it was not Lansky, but William Donovan, the director of the OSS, who obtained the original photos of Hoover, and either he or another person at the OSS or early CIA had later shared them with Lansky. Summers also states that, to gangster Frank Costello and Lansky, the ability to corrupt politicians, policemen, and judges was fundamental to mafia operations. The way they found to deal with Hoover, according to several mob sources, involved his homosexuality.